The real reason why you think lemmings kill themselves by jumping off of cliffs is way darker than you think. Most people are familiar with lemmings and the fact that they are apparently so dumb that if one of them falls off a cliff, the rest of their herd will just blindly follow after them, essentially offing themselves by the hundreds. The term lemming has become a shorthand for a person who just blindly follows orders and doesn't think critically about things. And there was even a popular franchise of video games in the 90s whose main goal was to protect a herd of lemmings from falling to their deaths. But the reality of the situation is that they don't do this, like at all. But the reason why you think it's true is because of a nature documentary that Disney put out in the 1950s and its murderous, psychopathic director. Now, the myth about lemmings jumping off of cliffs has actually existed since the 1500s. Back then, geographers were trying to explain why lemmings would appear in regions in large populations and then suddenly disappear. And so they came up with a theory that lemmings would rain from the sky during storms, and then in the spring they would kill themselves en masse by jumping into the ocean as part of some weird life cycle. And then in 1958, Disney released a nature documentary called White Wilderness, directed by James Algar. There was a very famous scene that showed a big herd of lemmings plunging off the side of a cliff to their deaths, while the narrator explained that this was called the lemming death march, where if one lemming fell off the cliff, the rest would just blindly follow. And White Wilderness was very popular at the time, actually winning the Oscar for Best Documentary that year. And similar to a documentary like Blackfish, which single-handedly ruined the reputation of SeaWorld, White Wilderness was so ubiquitous that basically everybody started believing that this was just a thing that lemmings did. But in the 1980s, a Canadian news program called Cruel Camera aired an episode that investigated the making of White Wilderness, and they revealed that the entire lemming scene had been completely staged by James Algar and his crew. The scene was filmed in Alberta, Canada, which doesn't even have a lemming population, so all the lemmings were flown in for the scene, and then they were put on these little turntables and spun until they got really dizzy, and then the filmmakers intentionally pushed them off the cliff in order to get the shots. It turned out that director James Algar had believed the folklore about lemmings jumping off of cliffs, and so he promised Disney that he would get a shot of that for the documentary, and it was going to be the centerpiece of the whole thing. But when he couldn't find it actually happening in the wild, he just made it happen on his own. The real reason why people observe large numbers of lemmings disappearing in certain regions is because they have mass migration patterns, where if too many lemmings appear in a certain area, many of them will leave in order to find more room. And scientists believe that the reason behind the myth of lemmings jumping into the ocean to their deaths is because during these migration patterns, sometimes the lemmings would drown in rivers and lakes while they were crossing them and wash up on the shore. But who needs all that sciencey stuff when you can just murder a bunch of lemmings?